Welcome to Crossing the Chasm. Today, I'm delighted to invite Saamah Abdallah. Saamah is an internationally recognized expert in the growing field of well-being. He has worked with a wide range of actors, from small community groups to businesses to governments to international bodies like the EU and the OECD, to embed well-being measurement and science into policy and practice. Saamah studied experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge and democracy and democratization at University College London. Between 2006 and 2016, Saamah worked at the Center for Wellbeing at the New Economics Foundation, an independent London think tank whose mission is to transform the economy so that it works for people and the planet. During his time there, he led work on new measures of societal progress, such as the Happy Planet Index, and measuring well-being at the local level, such as the Santa Monica Wellbeing Index. It is thanks to the work of organizations like the New Economics Foundation that well-being is now measured by official statistics agencies in most wealthy countries, and that countries such as New Zealand, Italy, and the UK have begun integrating well-being into policy. Saamah played a key role in the development of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, a UK government-funded initiative to marshal and disseminate well-being evidence that is useful for policy and practice, and still cooperates with them closely today. Saamah is a member of the Eurostat Expert Group on Quality of Life, and in 2016 won the award for Emerging Leader in the field of community indicators. In the same year, Saamah swapped life in the big city to move to a small town in eastern Germany. He lives there with his wife and 7-year-old daughter and is currently focusing on 2 challenges: completing a PhD in communication science and learning German. Saamah is still involved in the field of well-being, contributing to the Center for Thriving Places work on local level indicators of well-being and developing a better understanding of what community well-being means. Saamah's work is super interesting and has many insights and implications for our society. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for listening. Saamah, welcome to Crossing the Chasm.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. I'm super excited to have you. Looking forward to chatting. And just to begin, I would love to have you reflect a little bit and say something about how you see the chasm or chasms in our society as they relate to your interest areas around well-being.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I think about sort of this question of, how do we cross the chasm, and I think about well-being, I guess you can see this question in 2 ways. And it depends on what your objective is, like what's on the other side of the chasm. So if it's about increasing well-being, so if it's about sort of looking at society and saying, well, we live in a society where there's high rates of mental health problems, suicide rates, and this sense that sort of that life isn't getting better, that somehow we've kind of flatlined in terms of well-being over the decades, and there's a sort of sense of sort of what are we doing wrong? Then, well, the chasm there is one between a situation where we've got quite a bit of research, I guess, now, which shows what is important to people's well-being. But we're not doing the thing. So I mean, I won't go into details now, but there's a whole list of sort of things that we know predict people's well-being, and sort of they're the basic things like unemployment, sort of good sense of community, inequality, but it's also about our lifestyles, right? So you could think about the chasm as saying, well, how do we get, from this research base, and some of it is actually not just research, just sort of what you might call sort of basic wisdom about, we know how, there's all sorts of wise messages which people have known throughout society, and we don't necessarily follow them. No, so how do we get to that other side? I would say that the chasm there is quite. There's a lot of chasms there, and I think it is a sort of a big, there's a lot of questions there. I would say one of the biggest ones is political, because a lot of the challenges we face are in terms of economic redistribution. So when you think about a lot of the problems in terms of people who have low well-being, it's often about sort of material circumstances. But to be honest, when I came into working in well-being, I was thinking about a different kind of chasm. I was thinking about the chasm between when we think about sort of the challenge of dealing with climate change and environmental destruction, environmental problems. And there, it's quite a different chasm. There, we've got in some ways, there's a lot of similarities. There, we've got, we know what we need to do. We've got all the sort of the solution. We've got lots of ideas of how we can reduce the impacts we have. And again, we don't do it. And in that sense, I think that well-being, rather than being the chasm or being the other side of the chasm, whatever it is, I would say it's more like a way that can help us to cross the chasm. Because I think one of the problems we face when we want to tackle climate change and sort of change our lifestyle so that we can live in a way which is more environmentally friendly is that we don't know what's on the other side. We don't know what this other life really looks like. And I think that well-being research and well-being science is a little kind of, not the bridge. It's not going to sort of like just something you can just walk over to get to the other side. It's more like a postcard. It's more like something like that gives us a picture of what the other side looks like. And that's where I think it can be useful.
Really interesting. I think there's a lot to explore there. I think many listeners have heard of well-being and probably think about it, but maybe not know how it's defined or even how they define it necessarily. So could you just provide a little background on what you mean by well-being?
Yeah. So well-being is a very simple but perhaps circular definition. Is a good life. It's having a life that's worth living. But that is, there's still lots of different ways of defining that. Well, what is a good life? I think there are two main ways that people have looked at this sort of understanding of what it means, what is well-being and what is a good life. One is an approach which focuses on what you might call objective measures. So it's based on an idea of, this is what people need to have a good life. They need to have a good income. They need to have shelter. They need to have good health, education. And this has kind of been the dominant way of thinking about well-being for many, for many decades, for the last sort of 5 or so decades. And if you think about the United Nations Human Development Index, for example, then that includes GDP, so it's a measure of economic conditions, health, and education. The problem with this approach is that it's very sort of top-down. It's like someone has tried to decide what they think is what are the requirements for a good life. And it doesn't sort of get to the point of, do people who have high income, health, a good health and high education, are those people necessarily actually happy with their life? Do they consider they have a good life? And do the people who don't have those things, do they necessarily think that they have a bad life? And that's why, and you could extend the list. So there's an approach called the capabilities approach, which kind of looks at a huge list of different things which it thinks are important to life. But it still, for me, is kind of trying too hard to avoid the simplest way of trying to work out whether someone has a good life, which is just to ask them. And so this is the approach which has now become quite sort of popular. When I started working on this in 2006, it was definitely on the fringes, but now you can see it. Like most developed countries now measure subjective well-being in official statistics, and it's become a much more sort of acceptable way of thinking about well-being. And and basically the idea is that you can ask people whether they think they're having it, whether they're happy with their life, whether they're satisfied with their life. There's different ways of formulating it, and you trust them. And different people have different things which are important to them. So they define their own criteria when you ask them that question. But at the end of the day, they all understand. You can ask a child at school, are they happy? You can ask your colleague at work if they're happy with their life, and you can ask a 90-year-old farmer in any country in the world if they're happy, and they'll understand that question.
So there has been a little bit of pushback in recent years around this whole notion of happy, and the way in which it leads people to counterintuitively being unhappy, basically, because there's this sort of notion of what it is. And if you don't have it, you're not doing well. So I guess one of the questions I have is just on words. We talk about, well-being, we talk about flourishing, we talk about happy. Are those all relatively the same terms, do you think? And are those the ones that are being used interchangeably in these kinds of analyses?
It depends on what your purpose is, and are we talking about are we looking at this from an academic perspective? Are you looking at this from the perspective of someone who has a project and wants to know whether the project is improving the lives of the people you're working with? Are we talking about it from a sort of a policy perspective? And of course, within the academic world, there we spend a lot of time arguing about what's the best way to measure this, what's the best words what's the best words to talk about what we're measuring. And there are important differences to recognize. So there is a distinction between what you might call what people do call hedonic well-being. So this is the idea of sort of like your sort of experience within your emotions within a moment. So basically, are you happy or sad at a particular moment in time? And obviously that's quite variable, right? So it can go up and down depending on whether you're child is screaming at you because they want something that you're not going to give them, and then it can change very quickly when you're then having a nice time with them, playing a game of football or whatever. That hedonic well-being is very sort of instantaneous. It sort of happens in the moment. And some academics have said, well, the true way of understanding well-being is you kind of add up all those moments over time. And that's one way of looking at it. Then there's another way of talking about well-being, which is this more sort of evaluative well-being. So this is when you ask people, how satisfied are you with their life, with your life? And people tend to use words like satisfaction, evaluation. And sometimes people say happy with your life, which is kind of different from are you happy at the moment, right? That kind of encourages people to reflect on their life in a broader sense. So then you're not just asking how you're feeling now, you ask them to sort of think about the overall picture. And when you measure that over time, that's quite stable. It's not completely stable, but it's more stable than this sort of, are you happy now? People are able to kind of, reflect, okay, maybe I'm feeling a bit miserable now, but I'm satisfied with my life overall. And then there's the third approach, which is you use the word flourishing. And that's a word that's been supported a lot by Martin Seligman, who's one of the sort of key guys in the world of well-being. And it's also called eudaimonic well-being, which kind of tries to sort of take on a little bit of Greek philosophy in there. And there's quite a lot of different ways of understanding that. But basically, that's somewhere in between the objective and the subjective approach. It's basically saying, okay, well, no, we're not going to give you a shopping list of all the things that are important to a good life in terms of the physical things. We're not going to say, okay, you need to have a good education, you need to have a house, you need to have an income above this amount. But we are going to tell you what we think is important in terms of that, in terms of the sort of the more sort of experiential components which are important to a good life. So some people will talk about saying things like, well, everyone needs to have good relationships, a sense of autonomy, and a sense that they're able to make a positive impact on other people and on themselves. So there's a sense of competence. So that's one way of thinking about this sort of flourishing approach. Then Martin Seligman has a different approach. I'm not going to be able to list off the 5 things right now, but he's got a list of 5 things which he says, okay, this is what you need for flourishing. I like this approach because it's a little bit, it is, and this is kind of when you go into sort of the policy world and people want to say, they just want to measure one thing and they just say, okay, we're just going to measure life satisfaction. Is that enough? I quite like saying, well, no, actually it is better to have this rounder picture. But in the end of the day, actually, when you look at the things, of course, they do kind of tend to correlate. So the things that we know that the things that are going to improve people's happiness, well, their life satisfaction or their happiness with their life are also likely to improve their sense of flourishing. There are differences. It's kind of, as an academic, I like to point out those differences, but it's more or less the same picture. Yeah.
So let's move into those specifics a little bit. I'm curious if you could articulate what you think are the most important indicators or the indicators that are the most useful in identifying well-being and whether people feel like their lives are satisfactory. So this sort of headline indicator, which has become dominant in Europe at least, and is this sort of measure of life satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 0 to 10? And this has been sort of supported by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it's measured in all European countries, and quite a lot of Latin American countries use it as well. In the US, actually, so the US, I said most developed countries are measuring well-being in official statistics. The exception is the US. At the national level, there's been a lot of interesting stuff at the local level and community level to measure well-being, but at the national level there isn't a measure. And there's kind of a little bit of a vacuum of sort of if the US does end up measuring well-being, what is it going to use? Then when you sort of talk about sort of the more detailed measurements, so yeah, I'm quite a fan of this. It's called self-determination theory, which has been around for quite a long time in terms of sort of what are the basic psychological needs that people have. So you're having strong relationships, so you can ask questions about people's relationships and whether they feel sort of, one way of asking is if people feel lonely or not. So, and that's kind of quite a key issue in a lot of countries at the moment, the sense that people, as we become more atomized, more people live alone. I think I just saw something which said that in New York, it was some astonishing percentage of households are just one-person households. I think it might be 30% of households, something like that, in New York are single-person households. So a lot of people are living alone in these very atomized lives. Or, the other extreme, you can think about elderly people in rural areas
where their families have migrated to cities, and the old people end up being alone and again lonely. So that's kind of, particularly in today's society, something that I think is important to measure and pay attention to. And then the other thing, so for example, the UK measures this, which I think is quite, which kind of quite happy with. They follow that advice. Is a sense of that what you do in your life is worthwhile. So the sense that you're contributing to society, and for many people that's related to their work. So you can see that work has an impact on people's life satisfaction, but like this kind of the specifics of what people do in their jobs makes even a bigger difference on their sense of worthwhile, sense of purpose. And we did some work in the UK, sort of looking at the particular nuances and the differences between those two measures. And it also picks up things like volunteering, right, and social and your community activities. And that's again something which I think is important to highlight and to build in today's society, the sort of sense of kind of community and working together. And so that's an indicator which I definitely, I think is important to capture when you're measuring well-being.
So it's interesting that you raise that issue of the fact that many people associate their work life with their overall well-being. I think a counter argument could be that we're so focused and fixated on work that we've lost sight of what we actually really need and care about. And so I guess the question is it possible that people are maybe answering the questions in a way that reflects that linkage to their job and to status that's sort of overshadowing what their real needs and wants are? Is that possible? Or are the data coming out on this misleading in some ways, do you think?
So there are differences in terms of like when you look at different job characteristics and whether they affect life satisfaction or this sense of purpose. And I think there are definitely some factors which affect life satisfaction more than sense of purpose, and they are things which I would relate to what you just said there about status, right? So income is more connected to life satisfaction than sense of purpose. So I think you're right. When people evaluate their life satisfaction, and then there's another question which asks you, like, where are you on the ladder of life? Like, are you at the top of the ladder or the bottom? That's definitely, then you're definitely thinking about sort of societal expectations and, have you achieved a good status, right? I would say that sense of purpose, and there are other, I'm sure there are lots of other questions that academics use to kind of tap into this. I would say that I think people are not thinking about their purpose, that they're sort of like this status as strongly in those contexts. So you've got things like, so when we did analysis in the UK, you could see that people who work in the education sector, for example, in the health sector, much higher sense of worthwhile. But actually, I don't even know if they even have like higher life satisfaction, probably even lower life satisfaction, but it's a higher sense of purpose, right? So that kind of, to me, makes sense. There's a sense of where those people are aware that they are contributing to society. Other more kind of subjective elements of work. So do you feel like you are able to, when you have more autonomy, that sort of thing, also more likely to impact on your sense of purpose?
I'm curious if you could say something about just the general status of people, around the world. Maybe you can give some specific examples, but how are people doing based on these kinds of indicators and the work that you all are doing? How are people doing?
Are we doing well? Good question. So when you look at, I'm trying to think sort of the latest data that I've seen. So when you look across sort of developed countries, I think the average on that 0 to 10 scale for life satisfaction is like, in some countries it goes up to just below 8. So the happiest countries in the world are mostly sort of Scandinavian countries. And I think the average there life satisfaction is just shy of 8, I think like 7.8 or 7.9. In other countries, I think in Western Europe and the US, you're kind of looking at sort of between 7 and 7.5. And then you go to the other end, I guess the countries which have the lowest levels of life satisfaction, like in sub-Saharan Africa, then you're looking at figures like around 5 or below 5 even on the 0 to 10 scale. So like, I think globally the average is above 5. So, if you're being very blasé about it, you could be, okay, well, we're above average, so that's great. But of course, there's a little bit of an element of, well, what actually is average? Like, is 5 really the average on a 0 to 10 scale? I think it's a little bit hard to to really make that claim. I think that most people, even if there's, personally, if I'm feeling like a bit miserable, I would probably say, I'm about a 6 on the 0 to 10 scale. I probably wouldn't go so extreme negatively. So there are obviously sort of like psychological biases in the way people respond to these scales. And it makes it a little bit hard to kind of say, yeah, we're doing well or we're not, on a sort of a global level. One thing which I think was very interesting was looking at the changes to well-being during the pandemic. And so the last big project I did in this area was on the Happy Planet Index, which I can tell you a little bit about later, but where we looked at well-being and ecological footprint and life expectancy for all the countries across the world up until, from 2006 until 2020 for some countries. We weren't able to get data for all countries, but up to 2020 for some countries at least. Yeah, and then you can see, unsurprisingly, that the pandemic did have an impact on well-being. Well-being did fall globally, but it didn't fall in all countries. And obviously, there were some countries that weren't very badly hit by the pandemic in 2020, at least. So, for example, well-being didn't fall in India, where I think the pandemic hadn't really hit by then. Of course, then India had that horrible wave in 2021, but we don't have the data for that yet. But it also didn't fall in some countries which were hit quite badly by the pandemic. So I remember hearing a presentation by someone from the Italian statistics agency, Istat, and they collect official data on well-being with using a big sample, so it's kind of much more robust than some of the more international surveys. And they said that they found an increase in well-being during the pandemic, and even more of an increase in places which were harder hit by the pandemic. And that's quite interesting, obviously, because it's sort of, obviously the accepted wisdom, and, obviously in terms of so many things, the accepted wisdom is the pandemic is the worst thing that's happened to the world this century. But it seemed to have some positive side effects in some societies. And in Italy, for example, there's a lot of talk about how it brought people together, a sort of strong sense of community, sort of neighbors helping each other and this sort of stuff. But it wasn't like that in all countries. In the UK, the well-being fell, for example, during the pandemic.
So that raises a question about the extent to which individual well-being is really tied to other people. That is to say, how well they are connected with friends, family, social support networks, and so forth. How well do you think that is understood and analyzed in these different kinds of metrics and indicators for well-being?
Yeah. I mean, we know that people's relationships is one of the biggest predictors of their well-being. And there was a study that was done ages ago, like 20 years ago, which was called Very Happy People. And it was just like trying to look and see what are the predictors, not of sort of slightly above average well-being, but really high well-being. And it was the strongest predictor. The thing that sort of really stood out was people's social networks. So people who had stronger social networks were particularly happy. And, and I think, it's quite intuitive. We know that other people are very important to us. And I would say in terms of how well is that captured in wellbeing metrics, I think it's captured pretty well, because at the end of the day, if you ask people how they feel about their lives, they will, they'll say whether they won't necessarily tell you why they're unhappy, but you can be sure that if they're unhappy because of poor social relationships, that'll come out in the data. So, you don't have to directly ask people about their relationships to know that there's an impact going on there.
I want to go back to something you said a bit earlier about the ecological footprint and linking that with well-being. I've seen some really interesting work that suggests that it's counterintuitive. We always think about the Scandinavian countries as being like the best off and the most environmental, but that's actually not true at all. And what's clear is that there are other countries like Costa Rica and Cuba, which are always the examples given, which have way lower ecological footprints, way less money and wealth and profit and so forth. But they live longer, they have much greater social connections. And it seems like in general, these indices say that they actually feel like their life satisfaction is higher. So can you say anything about that? And in general, what are those linkages between sort of the ecological outcomes and also the well-being of people in different societies?
Yeah, so it sounds like you've been reading articles about the Happy Planet Index, because that's basically, Costa Rica has been, so we've done the Happy Planet Index 4 or 5 times now, and Costa Rica has come out top in, 4 out, I think, we've done it 5 times, we've come top 4 out of 5 times. but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I wouldn't say that necessarily Costa Rica is happier than the Scandinavian countries. So if you just look at pure subjective well-being element of it, Costa Rica scores very high, but not higher than those Scandinavian countries you mentioned. The reason it did well on the Happy Planet Index is because the Happy Planet Index takes subjective well-being, it takes life expectancy, multiplies them together, and then divides that by ecological footprint. Yeah, so it's kind of an efficiency measure rather than a measure of happiness. So it's basically which countries are more efficient at achieving high well-being. And then Costa Rica comes out much higher than Scandinavian countries because life expectancy, for example, in Costa Rica is probably a little bit lower. I mean, we often make the comparison with the US because then it's quite stark. So when you compare Costa Rica with the US, Costa Rica's life expectancy and life satisfaction is a tiny bit higher than the US's, but the ecological footprint is a quarter the size. When you compare Costa Rica with the Scandinavian countries, then you'll see that Costa Rica's life satisfaction, life expectancy is a little bit below those countries. But again, the ecological footprint is much lower. So when you think about it in terms of efficiency, it comes out very well.
So that's interesting. I mean, I just read an interesting article on Costa Rica, which was comparing the sort of health sector in the US and Costa Rica. And they spend a fraction of what the US spends on healthcare, and yet they live longer on average. So again, it's these mismatches. So I guess I'm curious about just in general, these sort of measurements of well-being. What do they tell us about society? And more importantly, does it give us any insight in how we should do anything public policy wise to better people's lives and increase, or decrease environmental consequences, for example?
Yeah, I mean, to the point on health. I mean, obviously, it's a perfect example of why it's important not to measure input. You need to measure output, and in many countries, you can spend lots of money on trying to cure people from diseases, but it'll be a lot cheaper if countries just prevented those diseases in the first place. So, preventative approach in terms of, and that's not even necessarily something that's the responsibility of the healthcare system. So you can do it like that. So in the UK, we used to have this public health body, whose responsibility was to try and improve, to foster preventative approaches. So encourage people to eat fruit and vegetables, encourage people to do physical activity so that they wouldn't, end up with heart diseases and diabetes and also preventable diabetes and other illnesses. So, but it doesn't have to be a governmental body at all. I mean, it's just, in a way, it's culture, it's society. So, we're in a culture and society where people eat healthier because that's just the way people live. That's the way it's done. The spending is irrelevant in a way. It's the way the culture works. So, a lot of the differences in life expectancy which you see in the world are probably more about, basically diet and lifestyle rather than expenditure on healthcare. What lessons can we learn from these? I mean, it's a big question. Sort of what lessons can we learn in terms of these international comparisons? I would say that there's a kind of two levels of lesson here. So on the one level, you can kind of look at the differences between sort of countries that are similar but not quite the same. Yeah. So you can look across Europe, or you can look within Latin America, or, if you can do this data within countries, you look between, compare states, you can start to sort of draw some patterns. So, there's been studies which have shown that states in the US which have higher economic inequality have lower average well-being, right? So that's a kind of thing that policymakers, for example, are used to looking at that kind of data and kind of drawing conclusions from. When you look across, and I haven't done so much of that stuff comparing countries, but when you look across, for example, different parts of the UK, you see, for example, quite surprisingly in a way, that sort of air pollution is quite a strong predictor of subjective well-being. We know it's a strong predictor of health, but it also is a strong predictor of subjective well-being, even though perhaps people aren't so explicitly aware of it. So those are things you can sort of draw lessons from. But I think there's a sort of a bigger message, and this is kind of why we developed the Happy Planet Index, which is kind of to say, firstly, okay, well, the way we're understanding progress is completely wrong, because we don't look at any of these three indicators when we're talking about the success of the country. We look at GDP and how much economic throughput it has. And so this is kind of, when you produce that climate index, like, no one can disagree that the three things we've got in it are important. And it's sort of like, yeah, okay, well, you're right. Of course, these things are more important than GDP. So it's that sort of questioning sort of what priorities are. So it's kind of, we talk about the climate index as a compass, right? It just kind of points you in the right direction. It's not really necessarily telling you which steps you need to take, but it gives you the direction. And it is also, it's meant to be a little bit of a sort of a positive message. So in a way, it never quite is a positive message, because, as I say, we've done this many years, and there's three indicators in it, and we've set, they're rather arbitrary thresholds, but we kind of set thresholds. When we first did this in 2006, we set thresholds of what we would count as a good performance on each of the three indicators, right? So what counts as a good life expectancy, what counts as a good level of life satisfaction, and for ecological footprint, we said, okay, basically what would be sustainable. So we used ecological footprint, the Global Footprint Network's definition of one planet living, and we said, okay, well, if a country achieves that, then that's a good performance in there. And we were disappointed in 2006 to see that no country was able to achieve, a good performance in all those three indicators. Plenty of countries do well on two indicators, but not all three. And we've seen that time and time again. And so, now I look at the data from up to 2020, and we've got 15 years of data, and still no country has achieved all good performance in all three indicators. Sometimes it's tantalizingly close, but it's never quite there. So it's not 100% positive message, but at least it's close, and it kind of highlights that, when we think about the lives that we have in rich industrialized countries, and we think this must be the only good way to live, we think, like, God, can you imagine living like people in poorer countries? It must be awful. And what the Climate Index shows is actually, no, it's not. It's not. It might be, obviously there are countries which, the countries which do worst are sub-Saharan African countries where life is particularly difficult. But when you look sort of just a little bit lower down the the GDP rankings, you can see countries which do a lot better, and it shows that, okay, it is possible to lead a good life that doesn't cost the earth. We just need to change how we organize our economy.
And I want to get to that in just a minute, but before we do, I'm curious if you think there are any examples where countries have used any of these well-being indicators, statistics, trends, and use that specifically to implement policy. Do you think this is leading to fundamental policy change? Are there any examples of that?
Oh, I thought you would ask that question. So there are definitely examples at the margins. The UK it's often quite hard to see it, because at the moment it's still a little bit there haven't been any cases of someone saying, we have done this and we have done this because of well-being. At least not in terms of like articles that hit the news. Anecdotally, I have heard of, I would say it's more about the approaches rather than the statistics. So in the UK, for example, there has been quite a talk around the sort of well-being approach to policy. And, there are various frameworks which people use to think about well-being. And I know that is used in some departments, or it has been used in some departments to think about policy, and has informed various ideas. So like in the UK, they introduced this sort of national citizen service for young people, I think when they're coming out of school, where they can do these kind of programs. And I know that well-being was kind of, was shaped that idea, and then they used well-being in the evaluation of this intervention. And the fact that well-being increased during this intervention was a case for continuing the intervention. So those are the kind of, I guess, that's not, economy shifting policy, right? But that's the kind of thing which I know is happening in New Zealand. New Zealand is often hailed as a leader in the well-being world. And so since, I think it was 2019, they did their first well-being budget. And I think it's quite recently they published the 2022 wellbeing budget, and this basically is where their treasury, their sort of their finance ministry as such, have officially are supposed to be thinking about wellbeing whenever they make any budget decisions. What have we seen in New Zealand? And I don't live in New Zealand, so I'm not an expert. So I'm just sort of reporting back what I've heard from other from other people and from people who are interested in well-being in New Zealand is a sense of, yeah, it's kind of been semi-good. It's like gets things going in the right direction. It hasn't led to any sort of like earth-shattering changes in policy, but it's sort of tended to push things in the right direction. So you kind of, in terms of sort of, we know that inequality is one of the biggest drivers. Well, economic deprivation is one of the biggest drivers of low well-being. So, when you see in the budget more attempts to alleviate poverty, and in particular child poverty, then you can see that there's it's consistent with the well-being literature. It's consistent with the well-being literature. They're talking about well-being. Does that count as well-being shifting policy? Yeah, I mean, obviously things are never so linear, right? So that's the state of affairs, I guess, at the moment. I think there's another thing which I think is interesting to. Some people will say, "Oh, we know everything about well-being. It's great," and we, there is a huge wealth of literature, and we do know a lot, but it's still tricky for us to really bring it all together. So, economists, have their economic models about sort of what's going to have an impact on GDP, and they have this model of, okay, well, if we shift taxes, from this group to the other, what's going to be the impact on GDP? And okay, the models aren't 100% perfect, but at least they think they are. At least to give you some sense of, it gives some people a sense of confidence when they make decisions about policies in terms of the impact they're going to have on GDP. We don't have models like that for well-being, so we don't have this sense of, okay, well, if we shift spending away from education towards mental health, for example, we don't know what we don't have a model where we can just plug that in and see what that's going to do to average well-being. And so, and that's the kind of thing that at least economists in government and economic analysts see as the benchmark. They kind of see, well, okay, well, this well-being stuff, it's all nice, but if we don't have the tools to really understand how to change it, then we're not going to be able to use it. And yeah, I mean, there's some validity in that. I mean, you could argue, well, we just need to do things based on what we think is right rather than economic models, but that's another challenge to face.
So I want to ask you in just a minute about what you think we should do. But before we get there, I guess I'm curious from your perspective whether this data, and again, this whole area of well-being, does it tell us why people are not doing well? Do we have a good sense of what those pressures are or drivers of why there aren't more people doing well?
I mean, I do think it's important to say that in the Western world, still people aren't doing badly, right? So as I said, sort of when you asked me sort of earlier on, sort of what's the average well-being, and in most Western countries, we're talking about an average which is above 7 out of 10. So I mean, and I guess that's sort of, I came to well-being more as a tool to address environmental challenges rather than sort of wanting to focus just on well-being on itself. So for me, I'm not interested necessarily in sort of how can we increase well-being. I'm more interested in how can we reduce our environmental impact without decreasing well-being. But let me answer your question because I think it's only fair. So I think there are there are two kind of sets of barriers, right? So I'd say there's the kind of barriers that we know about already, that sort of people talk about in policy already, in which are kind of standard fare for people who are in any way left wing or socialist or liberal. So it's having a reasonable income. So we know people who have a low income have low well-being. Doesn't mean that having a high income means you have high well-being, but you need a certain threshold. That's one. Secondly, obviously health and just sort of having, and then health in a sense of sort of being healthy in a sort of very sort of outcome oriented way. But when you think about sort of particularly in the situation in the US and other countries where there isn't guaranteed healthcare, it's having the sense of security of health, right? So those are two things. And the third thing, which I think is important, and I think sort of has led to some conversations amongst economists, is the importance of having a job. And obviously we know that having a job is important, but not just in terms of the economic benefit, the sense that a job gives people a sense of meaning and social relationships as well. So, some people would argue, some people would look at the wellbeing literature and say, okay, well, this shows that, we need to make sure people have jobs. It doesn't matter what kind of job it is. It could be a shit job. It could be low paid. As long as they've got a job, that's going to be good for their wellbeing. I think that's a little bit exaggerating, but but there is some sense that sort of, for me, the well-being literature certainly speaks against the idea of having a basic income, like replacing jobs with just give people money and let the robots do the work. That for me is not the way forward. But anyway, so those three things are things that we know are important: health, income, job. We know they're important, and well-being sort of supports that and kind of pushes us in the way towards focusing on those three determinants.
I just heard an interview with this anthropologist, basically, and his insights were quite enlightening for me personally, which is we know that 70% of worldwide workers hate their jobs. And we know that most jobs are not super meaningful. They don't serve a good purpose, which goes back to your earlier points, where having a sense of purpose is important. We also know that the anthropology is quite clear on this, that if you just give people a basic income, it's not like they just lay around all day. There is sort of by virtue of being a human being, the sort of need to do something. So I guess I'm curious about that because, again, going back to my earlier question, is it a case that we have contrived what we mean by well-being in the context of, modern capitalism, where our social status is connected quite tightly to how much money we make? We know that it's a globalized economy where you basically can't have a situation in which people or countries are not connected to the global economy. I guess I'm wondering how much of all of that is embedded in this, because you've mentioned several times in passing that GDP is not a good indicator of people's well-being or countries' well-being. So I guess I'm wondering about all of those broad level influences and how those affect even our understanding of well-being from the very beginning.
Yeah, the basic income in question is one that I think I would say the jury is still out. There were certainly early studies that showed that if you just give people money, a lot of people do just tend to sort of lay about, and it's kind of, there is. People do feel they want to do something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's so easy to do. There's sort of, having a job is kind of forces you to, in a way, get up and engage with other people. So, but the jury's still out, and we need to see how that, what happens with that. But could you go back to the last point of your question? Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering about this broader sort of focus we have in society on money, profit, GDP, and how much that affects our worldviews such that it influences what we even perceive as well-being from the very beginning. Is there an objective well-being outside of the human sort of experience, which clearly is no, but to what extent does our place in this globalized capitalist world affect fundamentally how we even see ourselves and well-being? And is it the case that potentially completely transforms what we mean by well-being, such that we say certain things about what we need or want, which actually don't reflect our true interests, but are shaped by our society?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I don't know if it's even possible to answer it. To answer it, I think you do have to say, well, there is some sense of objective well-being, right? So, yes. The society, the capitalist society we have grown up in, all of us, pretty much. And, for those who grew up in a communist society, it's still a kind of a productionist society, and one which kind of communism also sort of fetishizes the idea of producing more. So there isn't a huge difference in terms of sort of what it means for this idea of produce. So we've all grown up in that, and it's hard to do, to work out, well, what would it have been like if in a different, there isn't this counterfactual of what our needs and stuff would be if we hadn't grown up in those societies. I would turn it around and argue, well, okay, but even if that is true, so you could say, okay, well, if we lived in a different society, then our needs would be different. And then maybe we would, maybe we would be less materialistic, right? So maybe if we all lived in a different society, we would be, not feel the need to, maybe we'd be very happy living a very sort of simple, primitive life, without very much, with one item of clothing or whatever, and, very, basic living conditions. And maybe that's true, and that would be good for the planet if we did. But we haven't grown up in that society. We've grown up in the society that we have, and And so in a way, we do have to work with, what I call the sort of the psychological limits to, well, people talk about the ecological limits to growth. And I would say, well, okay, there are also psychological limits to changing that system, because that I'm all for that change that system, but we have to recognize where we are at the moment. And so, I think we need to, for example, tackle materialism. I think the materialism is, in terms of what has capitalism done in terms of the way we think about our aspirations and what we want to achieve in life, I would say that materialism is the biggest negative outcome. I think you're also kind of implying that sort of this idea of productionism, sort of like productivism, is also an outcome of capitalism. Maybe that's right, but let me kind of focus on materialism now. So there are ways we can work on that, and there's and I think that's one of the kind of the key challenges that we need to face. And I say that that's one of the key lessons that we get from wellbeing, because on the one hand, yes, you're right that our well-being is shaped by our material circumstances in a way that's probably been influenced by living in a capitalist world, but it's not been shaped as much as you would expect. So as I mentioned before about sort of like the relationship between income and well-being, yes, people who have low incomes have low well-being, and that may well be partly shaped by our capitalist, the aspirations of our capitalist system has informed. But it's actually quite a low level of income where people's well-being is already sort of stable, right? So, and it's a lot lower than what people think would make them happy. So, people being able to kind of understand, from what we know from well-being, make the decision, okay, actually it does make sense for me to work less hours. I will have less money, but I will be able to spend more time with my family or in my community or doing things which I think are valuable. Yes, it does make sense for me to get rid of my car and travel with active transport or use public transport because it's going to be good for my health. It's going to be good for my subjective well-being as well. Those are kind of things which wellbeing literature does inform us, and they do work against materialism. So maybe that seems a little bit less radical and revolutionary than what you're suggesting, but I think it is an important first step at least.
So just to extend that a little bit, I want to ask you specifically, given your interests, your experience, your education, your expertise in well-being, what do you think we as society should do to increase well-being specifically?
Okay. Can I change the question to sort of say to increase well-being while reducing environmental impact?
Yes, of course.
That for me is the key. Yeah. I would say there are, for me, success would look like this. We could reduce working hours. So if we reduce working hours, when I was working at the New Economic Foundation, we talked about a 21-hour week. So as opposed to 35 or 40 hours, which is typical in most countries. So that would mean, obviously, we have less money, so we're consuming less. We're also producing less, but we have more time for interaction with other people, with society, with our family, with community. More time to engage in politics. More time to keep ourselves, to do other things which are important to our well-being, to well-being promoting behaviors. And of course, if we're consuming and producing less, that means a huge reduction in environmental impact. Lastly, the other win out of that is in terms of employment distribution. So, as we worry about there being less and less work to do because of automation, slowly reducing working hours for everyone rather than laying off half the workforce and giving them basic income, for me seems like a more sort of equitable way of dealing with it. A second thing is economic redistribution. I think that's obviously sort of one of the oldest debates in politics, but the wellbeing evidence suggests that if we have a significantly more fair income distribution, it won't have a negative impact on the well-being of those who are of the richest, but it will have definitely a positive impact for people with lowest incomes. And that, in terms of environmental impact, I would say it's a bit more mixed what the environmental impact of that would be. But definitely one of the positive side of things is if we have less wealth, then we have less sort of overconsumption, and we also have less of this aspiration for overconsumption. So, if we're not looking at the Elon Musks of the world and who are telling us how they're going to fly to go and fly to the moon, and we think, wouldn't it be nice if we could fly to Australia or whatever. in a way, sort of aspiring, sort of emulating this aspiration, then that'll be good in terms of environmental impact as well. The third, which is not to do with environmental issues, I guess, but which I think is important to remember, is mental health. So mental health has always been seen as a sort of less important than physical health. Government spend much less money on mental health and physical health, and yet we know that mental health has a huge impact on people's well-being, and is becoming, so it seems, a bigger problem. So sort of redirecting investment into mental health, I think, is an important part of that. But it's I wouldn't want to go on about that all the time, because I do think that sort of investing in sort of cures for mental health is probably a bit too downstream. I feel like we need to do more to prevent people developing mental health problems in the first place. I would say that another key factor is, our communities. How do we live together as communities? And, I mentioned already this thing about sort of the number of people who live alone and sort of atomization of society. And that's partly to do with the amount of time we have. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are like, oh, I'd love to, volunteer or contribute to my local groups, but I don't have the time to do it. So I think, having more time will be a key factor that would help us on that road. But then we also need to have the mechanisms to allow people to do things together. And so that means, for example, let's not abandon urban spaces. Like, the urban spaces are an important place where people come together and can do stuff together. Let's not sort of dream up a world where we all live in sort of an isolated places around the world where we don't have much connection with each other. Let's not dream up a world where we are all doing home, sort of like working from home with Zoom, where we don't have any sort of actual face-to-face contact with people. So those, I think, are some of the things that I would advocate for.
So just to end, I want to ask a couple of questions that are a little bit more personal. I'd love to hear, what do you see in society that gives you inspiration or hope?
I mean, staying on the theme of community groups, I'm always impressed by the amount that people do achieve. So I live in a small town in East Germany, which it's a kind of post-industrial, post-communist town, which had kind of a bit of a dark history in the past. It was there was a time just after the reunification of Germany when it was the place with the highest level of unemployment. There were lots of factories that were closed down, lots of problems with the far right in the past, neo-Nazis. And then, but it's done an amazing job in sort of transforming itself. Partly they set up a university here for sustainable development, and it attracted sort of different people, and it kind of brought a new energy to the city, and sort of improved the public transport network connection to Berlin, so that there's lots of people who live here but sort of are quite connected with Berlin. Either they work in Berlin or they just have more of that connection with the city. And the place is, I think from what I hear, I've only been here for 6 years, but I've already, I can see a change in that time. And it's just so much. There's so many little things going on here, which I find quite amazing. So just like lots of kind of organizing, giving things away for free. So there's this thing called Fair Tyler where food is collected from different places, and then it's just like left in the university, and people can pick. Well, some of it's left for people to pick up for students. Some of it's taken to places for people who are perhaps in more need than students for free food. And it's all obviously done voluntarily. And I mean, this goes on. I mean, that's just one example. You see this kind of stuff all around the world, but it is amazing how much people are willing to collaborate and do things to help others. And I do think that, it gives you hope.
Is there an example of something you've read or heard lately that really challenged your thinking or made you think in new ways about your own work or the state of society?
I mean, this is perhaps not mega recent, but for me, I would say that I had a shift in thinking around 5 years ago, or 6 years ago. Does that count as recent? I mean,
that definitely counts. Yes.
Okay. In the sense of, so I came from a perspective of sort of, you could try and achieve change in a sort of slightly more subtle way. So I felt that, okay, well, well-being is quite useful because it looks like a very sort of neutral term. It's something that people on the left and on the right can aspire to, can sign up to. But then when you actually sort of do the analysis and you do the statistics and you do the research, you can see that a lot of the things that will improve well-being are the kinds of things that I'd say are more on the left. So I've already mentioned redistribution and tackling materialism, those kind of things. And I guess I hope that you could somehow use this, you kind of get people to care about well-being, get people to sort of to take that as the golden metric, and then people would almost fall into sort of oh, well, in that case, then let's reduce redistribution. So I kind of imagine this to be a bit more of a sort of scientific kind of approach, and I think that sort of my experience over the years has kind of made it clear to me and then actually doing other work in terms of, so now I'm doing a PhD in communication science, and sort of recognizing that doesn't work, that people's preset values, but also their sort of their political tribes in a way shapes everything they see, and so especially when people are very political. So as soon as people don't change their political positions, they change what they think is important to support those political positions. And maybe that's a bit of a cynical, I don't want to end on that cynical note, but that's definitely something which I've learned and has sort of changed the way I've thought about things in recent years.
And lastly, this is a time when many people feel somewhat overwhelmed and dispirited. I'm wondering if there's anything in your day-to-day life that you do that brings you joy and helps give a different perspective on the world.
Yeah. I guess this is all going to be quite cheesy, and probably quite sort of standard, but sort of interacting with the future generation, with kids, and I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and obviously sort of interacting with her and her friends. I was quite impressed by the fact that my daughter last week said, "I've written a song, Daddy," and she kind of got her little notebook out and started singing the song to me, and it was all about the environment and improving the environment. I was like, wow, where did that come from? So that sort of so spending time with the younger generations, I think is very uplifting. And then so more of a sort of party line on sort of what do I do, but it's something that everyone can do. So when we were at the New Economics Foundation, we were asked to develop a sort of and a communication tool for how people can improve their own well-being. And my colleagues reviewed all the sort of huge stashes of literature on sort of what things are important to well-being, and with a focus on things that people can do in their own lives, right? So rather than the policy stuff, the more kind of individual level stuff. And they came up with the 5 ways to well-being, which are sort of 5 things that you can incorporate into your daily life to improve your well-being. And they are be active, so physical activity, connect with other people, obviously, keep learning. So, sort of not giving up on learning, and the fact that I'm learning the 5th language now in my 40s is probably part of doing that, keep learning. Give, which is obviously about volunteering, and take notice, which is just about appreciating the things around you. Yeah, and I try and do those things when I can, when I'm conscious enough or aware enough or sort of mindful enough to sort of think, okay, especially when you're feeling a bit down, it's important to kind of recognize those things and make sure you incorporate them into your daily life. And that's how I keep myself going.
Well, Saamah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
When I first started thinking about this podcast and the kinds of topics I wanted to cover, well-being was at the top of the list. And I am so glad and grateful for Saamah to spend time with me today to talk about that. His insights are really interesting, and he really is an expert. We could have talked a much longer time about all of these issues. He has tremendous expertise that, again, I think are just so important for thinking about how our society is organized and how it could be organized better so that people do better. As always, I want to thank the executive producers of Crossing the Chasm, Dan Phillips, Cody Bayless, and Chris Flores. And as always, thanks so much to Anodyne Diversion for the music. And thanks to you all for listening. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you can tune in again for another interview on Crossing the Chasm.